can sit in the back row, old man. Try not to embarrass yourself." That was my daughter's last text to me before I walked into the most expensive law office in downtown Chicago. She wanted me there for one reason: to watch her collect every last dollar of her mother's $140 million estate while I sat in a folding chair with nothing but the lint in my pockets. What she didn't know was that her mother had spent the final weeks of her life writing a letter that would set the whole room on fire. But before I tell you how it all went down, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe that a quiet man's patience can be the most powerful weapon in the world, hit that like button and subscribe. The smell of fresh pine shavings was the only perfume I'd worn in 6 years. My shop out in Bend, Oregon, sat at the end of a gravel road lined with juniper trees, and most mornings the only sound was the lathe spinning and the scrape of a chisel against maple. I made furniture. Tables, mostly. Honest, heavy, four-legged tables that families would eat dinner on for the next 50 years. Nobody knew my name out here. Nobody cared. I was just the old guy with sawdust in his beard who dropped off custom pieces at the hardware store on consignment. That was fine by me. I had stopped needing the world's approval a long time ago. My phone buzzed on the workbench, not the gentle hum of a weather alert, a sharp, insistent vibration that wouldn't quit. I wiped my hands on my canvas apron and looked at the screen. Vivian Donovan Chase, my daughter. We hadn't spoken in 4 years, and the last time we did, she told me I was a disgrace to the family name and hung up before I could respond. I answered. Miles. Not Dad. Not Father. Just my first name, spoken the way you'd address a plumber who showed up late. Mom is dead. Massive heart failure 3 days ago. The funeral already happened. You weren't invited? I leaned against the workbench. The wood creaked under my weight. Catherine. Gone. The word didn't make sense. Catherine Montreux Donovan was not the kind of woman who simply died. She commanded rooms. She built a textile empire from a single sewing machine in a rented garage in Charlotte. She had the kind of presence that made governors nervous and investors obedient. Dead felt like the wrong word for her. Her attorney needs you physically present for the reading of the will. Vivian continued, her voice clipped and irritated, like she was explaining something obvious to a slow child. Friday, 10 a.m. The offices of Whitmore and Callaway, Lakeshore Drive, Chicago. Don't be late, and don't wear your little carpenter costume. Why do they need me there? She laughed. It was a brittle sound, like a wine glass hitting tile. Legal formality. You were married to her once, so they need your warm body and a chair to make it official. Don't get excited. You're not getting anything. Mom made that very clear to me. She said the only thing you'd ever get from her again was the satisfaction of hearing the word nothing read out loud by a man in a $3,000 suit. A pause. Then softer, but sharper. Honestly, I just want to see your face when it happens. The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, looking at the half-finished table on my bench. Red oak. Beautiful grain. I'd been shaping the legs all week, feeling the curves take form under my hands like they were breathing. The wood never lied. It never betrayed you. It just was. I closed my eyes, and for 1 second, I let myself remember Catherine at 26. Long, dark hair tied up with a pencil. Charcoal smudges on her fingers from sketching dress patterns on butcher paper. We ate ramen noodles for dinner every night that first year in Charlotte, because every spare dollar went into fabric and thread. She'd fall asleep at her sewing machine, and I'd carry her to bed, and she'd murmur something about stitching counts and hem widths, even in her dreams. I loved her then. I loved her in a way that left permanent marks on my bones. But that woman was gone long before her heart stopped. I looked at my closet. In the back, behind the flannel and the Carhartt jackets, there was a dry cleaning bag I hadn't touched in 22 years. I unzipped it. A dark navy suit, good fabric, Italian cut. From a time when I could afford things like Italian cuts. It smelled like cedar and old decisions. I held it up to the light. It still fit. I'd lost weight. not gained it. Grief and manual labor will do that to a man. Friday morning, I flew into O'Hare on a budget ticket, middle seat, last row. The cab ride to Lakeshore Drive cost me more than my dinner budget for a week. The building was glass and steel, the kind of structure I used to design in another life. I'd been a civil engineer before everything fell apart. I understood load-bearing walls and stress points and how buildings distribute weight. This building was designed to make you feel weightless and insignificant at the same time. The lobby was white marble. The air smelled like money and lilies. A young woman at the front desk looked at my shoes, old, polished, but cracked at the toe, and made her assessment in about 2 seconds. I gave her my name. She directed me to the 14th floor without making eye contact. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway that was all dark walnut paneling and hushed carpet. At the end of it, I heard her voice, Vivian, laughing. The bright, performative laugh she used when she wanted the room to know she was in charge. I walk into the waiting area, and there she was. My daughter at 39, dressed in a black Chanel suit with her hair pulled tight, looking like a weapon. Next to her sat a man I recognized from photographs. Troy, her husband, a real estate developer with a jawline like a magazine ad and the moral compass of a parking meter. He was scrolling his phone, already bored. Beside him sat a younger woman in red lipstick and a two-tie blazer, clutching a leather portfolio. This was Amber, Vivian's personal assistant and, from what I'd gathered, her chief enabler. They were a unit. A polished, expensive, impenetrable unit. And I was the uninvited stain. Vivian saw me and stopped laughing. She looked me over. The old suit, the calloused hands, the deep lines around my eyes. And her expression settled into something between pity and contempt. You actually showed up. She didn't stand. She crossed her legs and tilted her head like she was examining a stray dog that had wandered into the lobby. I half expected you to just mail in your irrelevance. Troy glanced up from his phone, assessed me like a property he wouldn't bid on, and went back to scrolling. Vivian, I said. It's Vivian Chase now, she corrected. I dropped the Donovan years ago. That landed harder than she probably intended. Or maybe exactly as hard. A door opened at the end of the hallway, and the man stepped out. He was maybe 70, silver-haired, with the kind of face that didn't waste expressions on things that didn't matter. He wore a simple gray suit, no tie, and his eyes behind his glasses were steady and sharp. The eyes of a man who had spent 50 years reading people's worst intentions across conference tables. "I'm Stuart Pemberton," he said. His voice was quiet but carried. "I'll be executing Mrs. Donovan's final testament today. Please come in." He looked at me first. "Not Vivian. Me." And he held my gaze for just a moment longer than was casual. There was something in it. Not warmth, exactly. Recognition. Vivian noticed. I saw her jaw tighten. The conference room was a cathedral of mahogany and glass. A long table, 12 chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows showing the gray November sky over Lake Michigan. Vivian sat at the far end, Troy and Amber flanking her. I sat near the door. Pemberton placed a thick leather binder on the table. He sat down. He opened it. "This is the last will and testament of Catherine Elise Montreux Donovan, executed on June 15th of this year." He began to read. The first bequests were small. 10,000 to her longtime seamstress, Rosa, 5,000 to the groundskeeper at her estate in Lake Forest, a donation of 15,000 to a butterfly conservatory in North Carolina. And that one hit me like a fist. I knew why. Our second date, 1,000 years ago, we'd driven down to the mountains outside Asheville and found a meadow full of monarchs. She'd stood there with her arms out, spinning, laughing, orange wings landing on her shoulders like confetti. "Miles," she'd said, "I think this is what heaven looks like." She remembered, after everything she remembered. Vivian sighed loudly. "Can we speed this up?" Pemberton didn't look at her. He kept reading. "To my daughter's husband, Troy Mitchell Chase, I leave the sum of $1,000, with the strong suggestion that he use it to hire a private investigator to examine where his wife actually goes on her so-called business trips to Miami. Troy's head snapped up. His face went white, then red. He looked at Vivian. Vivian's eyes went wide, not with guilt, but with fury that the accusation had been made public. "That's slander," Troy hissed. "That's to my daughter's personal assistant, Amber Lou." Pemberton continued, unfazed. "I leave the designer sunglasses she stole from my bathroom vanity during Thanksgiving dinner last year. She may keep them with my compliments. They looked better on her than on me, though I suspect that wasn't the point." Amber's face turned the color of her lipstick. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at Vivian for rescue, but Vivian was staring at the table, her nostrils flared, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. "Mom is playing games," Vivian said through her teeth. "This is pathetic. Just get to the real part." Pemberton regarded her over his glasses. "Mrs. Perrimine." "Chase," he said, and the formality was a wall. "I am legally obligated to read every word of this document exactly as your mother wrote it. I will not skip, summarize, or abbreviate. You may leave if you find it unpleasant, but the reading will continue with or without you." Vivian's mouth snapped shut. Pemberton turned the page. "We now come to the primary disposition." The air changed. Everyone leaned forward. "To my ex-husband, Miles Jerome Donovan." My stomach dropped. "I leave the sum of $20. Vivian exhaled. A smile, slow, wide, savage, spread across her face. She looked at me, and her eyes were shining with a dark, terrible joy. $20, Pemberton continued, "to be paid in cash, which should be enough for a rideshare back to the airport, since my daughter once told me that's all he was worth." Vivian laughed. Not a giggle. A full, roaring, triumphant laugh that filled the conference room. She slapped the table. She pointed at me. $20. She was almost crying. "Oh my God, Mom, even dead. She's savage." She looked at Troy, who managed a weak, uncertain smile. She looked at Amber, who let out a sympathetic snicker. Then she looked at Amber, who let out a sympathetic snicker. Then she looked at me, and her face hardened into pure, polished cruelty. "There it is, Miles. There's your legacy. $20. Not even enough for a decent tip." She reached into her Birkin bag, pulled out her wallet, and tossed a $20 bill across the table. It landed in front of my hands. "Here, keep the change." I didn't touch it. I didn't look at her. I looked at Pemberton. He was sitting perfectly still. His hands were folded on the binder. He was watching the scene with the patience of a man who had been given very specific instructions and intended to follow every single one. He was not finished. Vivian stood up, adjusting her jacket. "Well, that's that. Pemberton, have your office send the paperwork to my attorney. I assume the rest, the company, the properties, all of it is mine." She grabbed her bag. "Troy, we have a reservation at Alina in 2 hours. Let's go." "Mrs. Chase." Pemberton's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It landed like a blade on stone. Vivian froze, one hand on her bag, half turned toward the door. "Sit down," he said. "I am not finished." "What do you mean you're not finished?" "You read it. $20. Joke's over." Pemberton reached into a briefcase at his feet. He brought up a second document. It was thinner than the binder, sealed with a dark red wax stamp. He placed it on the table. "That," he said, pointing to the leather binder, "was the original will. This is a codicil, a legally binding amendment, signed, witnessed, and notarized 12 days before your mother's death." He paused. "Its contents supersede and replace the primary estate disposition entirely." Vivian didn't sit. She collapsed. Her legs simply gave way, and she dropped into the chair. Her face lost all color. Troy put down his phone for the first time all morning. Pemberton broke the seal with the letter opener. He unfolded a single handwritten page attached to a thick stack of legal documents. He put his glasses on. "This is a letter from your mother," he said, looking at Vivian. "She instructed that it be read aloud in full, in the presence of all parties." Its contents formed the basis of the amended article. He began to read. To my daughter Vivian, I am writing this because I am tired of being a liar. For 22 years, I let you believe that your father was a thief and a fraud. That story was the foundation of your contempt for him. It was also the foundation of my empire, and it was entirely, completely, catastrophically untrue. Vivian made a sound like she'd been struck. I stopped breathing. In 2003, Pemberton read, Montreux Textiles was 6 weeks away from total bankruptcy. I had leveraged everything, the factories, the warehouses, even our home, on an overseas expansion that failed spectacularly. I had cut corners with federal import regulations. I had falsified customs documentation to reduce tariffs. I was facing not just financial ruin but criminal indictment. I was going to prison. The room was a vacuum. And then your father saved me. I closed my eyes. I was back in that apartment in Charlotte. 2 a.m. Catherine on the kitchen floor, shaking, mascara running. A stack of legal notices spread around her like fallen leaves. Miles, they're going to take everything. They're going to put me in handcuffs. What about Vivian? She's in high school. She can't. I can't. Her voice breaking apart like wet paper. I remember kneeling next to her, picking up the notices one by one, reading them, seeing the scope of the disaster she had hidden from me for months, the falsified customs forms, the shell importers, the tariff fraud, all of it done in desperation, all of it catastrophically illegal. And I remembered the choice. Pemberton's voice continued reading Catherine's words. Your father took my crime and made it his own. He used his engineering credentials, his professional reputation, and his name to restructure the entire paper trail. He created shell corporations under his license. He signed the falsified documents as if they were his. He built a legal firewall around me so thick that when the federal investigators finally came, they found his fingerprints on everything and mine on nothing. I could feel the tears now. I didn't fight them. He pleaded guilty to customs fraud and tax evasion. He lost his professional engineering license. He lost his reputation. His name appeared in federal court records as a convicted fraudster. He did all of this voluntarily, knowingly, and without hesitation. He did it because I begged him. I was on my knees, and he lifted me up. And when the dust settled, when I was free and the company was saved, I repaid him by letting you, our daughter, believe that he was the villain. No, Vivian whispered. She was shaking her head, her hands flat on the table, her eyes wet and wide. No, she wouldn't. That's not you. She pointed at me, her finger trembling. You told me you did it. You admitted it. I looked at her. My daughter. The girl I used to carry on my shoulders through the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. The girl who used to fall asleep with her head on my chest while I read her stories about brave knights. The girl who, at 17, called me a criminal in front of her entire school when the news broke and never looked at me the same way again. I admitted it to protect your mother, I said quietly. And you. Pemberton continued reading, his voice steady as a metronome. I told Vivian that her father had stolen from the company. I told her he had humiliated us. I let her hatred for him grow because every insult she threw at him was one less question she asked me. Her contempt for Miles was my shield. I hid behind my own daughter's anger for 22 years because I was too much of a coward to tell her the truth. The silence was so heavy it had a texture. The $140 million you expected to inherit exists for one reason. It exists because Miles Donovan sacrificed his career, his reputation, his family, and his dignity to keep me out of prison. Every dollar in this estate is soaked in his blood. You have never worked for any of it. You have never sacrificed for any of it. You simply spent it and judged the man who made it possible. Vivian was crying now. Not the pretty crying of movies. The ugly, gasping, open-mouthed crying of a person whose world has just been turned inside out. Pemberton turned to the final page. Therefore, having stated the truth I should have spoken 2 decades ago, I give, devise, and bequeath all of my property, real, personal, and corporate, all stocks, bonds, liquid assets, properties, and my complete controlling interest in Montreux Textiles and all subsidiaries, valued at approximately $140 million to my ex-husband, Miles Jerome Donovan, not as a gift, as a debt repaid, as inadequate restitution for a life I helped destroy. The words sat in the air like smoke after a fire. Vivian was staring at the table. Her mascara was running. Her Chanel suit suddenly looked like a costume on a child playing dress-up. She wasn't a CEO's daughter anymore. She wasn't a socialite. She was a 39-year-old woman who had just learned that the foundation of her entire identity was a lie her mother told to save herself. Troy stood up. He didn't say a word. He picked up his phone, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and walked out. No goodbye. No backward glance. He was a man who understood sinking ships. Amber followed 30 seconds later, clutching her portfolio like a life vest. Pemberton waited. The room emptied of everyone except the three people who mattered: him, me, and Vivian. And finally, Pemberton said, "For my daughter, Vivian Montreux Chase, who received a lifetime of luxury paid for by a man she refused to call Dad, I leave her precisely what she deemed her father was worth." He reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a certified check. He slid it across the table to Vivian. $20. Vivian stared at it. Her lower lip trembled. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She just sat there, broken, looking at that little slip of paper like it was a mirror showing her something she couldn't bear to see. Then, very quietly, she said, "Did she hate me?" Pemberton's expression softened for the first time all morning. "No, Mrs. Chase. In my experience with your mother over the final months of her life, I believe this was not hatred. It was the most painful kind of love. The kind that finally tells the truth, even when the truth demolishes everything." Vivian put her head in her hands. Her shoulders shook. I looked at her. My daughter. The girl who had called me worthless. The girl who had thrown a $20 bill at me across a conference table. The girl who was sitting there now with nothing but the rubble of her own assumptions. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt vindicated. But all I felt was tired. 22 years of tired settling into my bones like winter. Pemberton turned to me. "There's one more item, Mr. Donovan." He produced a small brass key from his breast pocket and placed it on the table. "Your ex-wife mentioned a safe deposit box at a bank on Michigan Avenue. She told me the box doesn't contain money. It contains the original federal investigation file, her handwritten confession, copies of every document you signed on her behalf, and a letter she wrote to you that she never mailed." He slid the key toward me. "She wanted you to have the choice. You can make it public and clear your name officially, or you can leave it sealed. That decision," she said, "was the one thing she had no right to make for you." I picked up the key. It was small and cold and heavier than anything that size should be. The $140 million, that was a weight. It was a complication. It was Catherine reaching up from the grave and pulling me back into a world I had spent 2 decades trying to forget. But this key, this was something else. This was her handing me back the one thing no amount of money could buy. My name. I put it in my pocket. Vivian lifted her head. Her face was swollen and raw. She looked at me, and for the first time in 22 years, I didn't see contempt. I didn't see anger. I saw a question. The same question she used to ask me when she was 5 years old and the thunderstorms rolled through Charlotte and she'd crawl into my lap, shaking, and whisper, "Daddy, is it going to be okay?" I didn't have an answer for her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some storms don't end with sunlight. Some storms just leave you standing in the wreckage, deciding what to rebuild. I stood up. I buttoned my old Navy suit jacket. I nodded to Pemberton. And I walked out of that conference room and into the hallway, my worn shoes quiet on the expensive carpet. Behind me, I heard a sound. Small. Broken. "Dad?" I stopped. I didn't turn around. Not because I didn't want to. Because I needed a moment. 22 years. 22 years of silence and sawdust and tables built for other people's families. 22 years of being a ghost. She called me Dad. I stood there in that hallway for a long time, my hand in my pocket, my fingers wrapped around that little brass key. The whole city of Chicago stretched out beyond those glass windows, steel and concrete and 10 million lives stacked on top of each other. I had designed structures once. I understood how weight was distributed, how pressure found the cracks, how even the strongest foundation could fail if you ignored the fractures long enough. I took a breath. And for the first time in 22 years, I turned around. This whole experience taught me something I wish I'd understood sooner. The truth doesn't expire. It doesn't dissolve just because you bury it. It sits there, patient as stone, waiting for someone brave enough, or desperate enough, to dig it up. Catherine spent her final days doing what she couldn't do in life, telling the truth. It cost her daughter's image of her. It cost her legacy. But it gave back something that had been stolen from a man who never stopped loving the family that discarded him. Honor isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up day after day in a workshop, in a quiet life, in hands that keep building even when the world says you're nothing. If you had that key in your pocket, the power to clear your name or leave the past sealed shut, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that patience is not weakness. It's the deepest kind of strength there is.